Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Art Like Everything Else, the podcast. This week, we're talking about normalcy, or the myth of it, rather. So, now normal, according to Oxford Dictionary, is defined as conforming to a standard, usual, typical, or expected. So often, we are expected to fit in the standard normal path to life. But we often aren't the people who get to determine what that normal is. And that got me thinking. Maybe the idea of normal, or of a normal life, is in and of itself a myth. Then I read the book by that name. So the book's called The Myth of Normal, and it's by Gabor Maté. And after reading that, I felt somewhat vindicated. Now, I won't be delving too deeply into his book, but I may make a couple of references here and there. I did want to look at the idea of normalcy, though, for this episode. And I wanted to look at the idea of normalcy through at least two different kind of areas, through two different lenses, I'll say. And I'm going to, through each of those lenses, I'm going to kind of reference the definition of normal that I mentioned earlier. And so let's get right started with our first work of art. Our first work of art, so to discuss the topic today, is The Truman Show. So this movie was released in 1998, and I'm not sure I'll be able to provide a spoiler-free version of this movie to get to the matter at hand, but I won't detail everything in the movie so that there is still some things to discover if you decide to watch it after this episode. So, like usual, if you want a completely spoiler-free watch of this movie, I recommend you go watch it and then come back. But I'm going to get started. So the movie follows Truman. He lives in a suburban neighborhood, and he works at an insurance office. Like a life insurance office, and that's kind of his day to day. He's married and he lives a relatively normal life. However, unbeknownst to Truman, everyone in this town is an actor. This entire town actually is just in a super duper elaborate set, TV set. There's thousands of hidden cameras everywhere that's essentially watching Truman's every move. And so he is just surrounded. And even though Truman believes he is living a normal life, the people who he believes to be his friends, his family, his neighbors, are all actors. And Truman is just this leading man in a 24/7 reality TV show, essentially. And so Truman grew up in this town. So his reality has always been living in this seaside little town that with his parents, and then growing up, staying local, and never actually leaving. Because unbeknownst to him, this is all a set. And so, even though this entire town is his whole life, it's his normal, everyone around him knows that this is not normal. And so, with this first piece of art, I wanted to interrogate, who gets to define what normal is? Whose idea of normal would matter in this situation? Do we go with Truman's idea of normal, which would be living in this town surrounded by people who are acting and people who are just essentially watching him and playing up his life for entertainment, or him who knows nothing different? He doesn't know a life outside of all that he's been experiencing, of all that he's going through. And yet everyone around him would be able to say, hey, this actually isn't normal. But he doesn't know that. He's not able to recognize that. So, does Truman's idea of normal here matters more than the idea of the person acting right alongside him? Does their idea of normal matter? The person who's never known different, or the people who know that there's a world outside of that set that exists? And so the idea of a standard or senior idea of normalcy is completely dependent on the person, with the definition of the word normal being conforming to a standard or usual, it is very obvious that what is considered standard or usual will differ based on who in this particular cast, like who in the Truman Show you ask. To Truman, everything he's experienced is normal. However, if you ask his wife and this who lives and who stays next to him, it is not normal. She recognizes that this is a set, that this is all just an elaborate TV show, but he doesn't know that. And so I'd say the same can be said for us. What is normal to me may not be normal to you. It can have to do with the experiences that we grew up with, the culture we grew up in, and even the time we were born. So like people born in the 50s, 60s, 70s, how they might experience what they grew up to believe what normal was doesn't look the same as what normal would be considered to people born like in the 90s, in the 2000s, in the 2010s even. And so like there's no set idea of normal when everyone works from a different experience and will likely view things through the lens of that experience. And so now, with our next piece of art, I'm going to look at normality through a different lens. Now, our next work of art is released just a year prior, and it takes the idea of normalcy it tackles the idea of normalcy from a different angle. So our next work of art is the movie Gattaca. So just like with Truman Show, I'm not going to be able to provide a spoiler-free version to kind of get into the definition and get into how this this movie kind of shows up with our topic at hand. So if you want a spoiler-free watch of this movie, I recommend you go watch the movie and come back. But I'm not going to spoil too much. Like I'm going to try to leave some things to be discovered if you decide to even watch the movie after this. And so, yeah. With that being said, I'm going to jump right into it. So, the movie Gattaca follows Vincent Freeman. He's a man who wants to go into space, and however, that's difficult. So, in this world, in this society, Vincent exists in what would be considered not being the idealized makeup of the society, essentially. So this society that Vincent lives in, they idealize almost like geneticism, essentially like peak genetic like essentially stuff. I think Elon Musk and like that weird quote of people obsessed with genetics. And so essentially, like with Gattaca, what they're doing is they're selecting like to be considered an idealized version of a citizen. The parents have to go in and like select the specific genes that they want in that child. So anyone who is born naturally or conceived in something that just sort of happens, they're often seen as invalid because the likelihood, like their genetics haven't been predetermined to make sure they're like the cream of the crop, essentially. And so like with living in a society that idealizes optimal DNA makeup so much, so they have a whole like genetic registry database that they'll determine like you have to register your DNA and you are determined whether or not you'll be considered a valid or invalid. And so using these biometrics, because of these biometrics, people are often sort of sequestered or like told that they can only assume or try to take on specific jobs. Now, using these biometrics, Vincent isn't able to, because of these biometrics, Vincent is considered an invalid because his parents conceived him as like just a spur of the moment type of thing. Like his DNA wasn't pre-selected. And so because of that, he's only allowed to attempt menial or manual labor jobs. But his dream job since he was a kid was to be an astronaut. But that job is only set aside for people who are considered valid. And so in this society, that's normal. In this society, determining who is better or who is made to be assumed or like assumed to be of like better as a better person, essentially. It's all built into their genetics. So if you are genetically built like this, then you are worthy of this or these better things. But if you do not have that genetic makeup, that will make you be considered to be an idealized sort of person, then you do not get to assume or be a part of or work in these upper echelon type jobs. So the expectation of the society is that like parents will do the thing where like they pre-select the genetics of their children and genetically engineer these children so that they can set them up for the best possible future. Now, later in this movie, Vincent is committing what will be seen as DNA fraud to get the job at the aerospace corporation that he's wanted to get since he joined since he was a kid. Because like I said earlier, he's wanted to be an astronaut or go to space since he was a literal child. And so like in committing this DNA fraud, he's actually like he successfully like outside of the biometrics, he's like he meets all the intellectual requirements, he meets all of the skill requirements, all the other health, like because they have like PT tests or like physical training type tests, he meets all of those requirements and is able to do all the things that they require of the people who are training to go into outer space despite being born as an invalid. However, had he lived by society's expectation of what was normal, he would have never even been considered to make his dreams be a reality because of how he was born. Now, I'm not saying that like you should go and commit fraud of any sort, but I think it's important that we interrogate who decides what is normal and what isn't. Because another part of that normal definition we talked about earlier is conforming to the expected. And in this movie, that sentiment of meeting the expectations placed by society is very present. Like if your genetic makeup does not meet these specific requirements, then you are not considered to be worthy of a job that would hold or require any type of status. Like a lot of the people who are considered invalid in this society are treated as like second-class citizens. So like they're using like phenotype profiling to determine what kind of work you can do. Like your actual physical capabilities or whether or not you're actually able to do that work doesn't matter because they're only looking at what your genetics say. They're not even considering what it is you can actually do. And this can be really dangerous when what is established as normal seeks to create or establish a hierarchy of those who are worthy and unworthy. And quite frankly, it can also be rather detrimental even to those who meet that requirement. So in this movie, this exact same movie, we meet Jerome, and Jerome is the person who's volunteering his DNA to Vincent so that Vincent can go into space like he wants to. And he's doing that because he was born valid. He was born as a valid child, and he was genetically engineered to be the best of the best. And so by all definitions of the word, Jerome met all of the requirements to be considered one of the people worthy of being in the upper echelon of this particular society. But it is because of these expectations of being worthy and supposed to have being in these upper echelon, when he fails, he gets so depressed that he harms himself in a way that he just can't go back from. Like he is supposed to be the best of the best. But when he loses in a competition that he feels like he was essentially genetically engineered to be the better participant, the best of the best for this competition, it hurts him mentally. He's not able to come to terms with the fact that he is now not able to ever be considered the best of the best, despite since being a child and growing up, he was said to be perfect, essentially. And so it's like those very same ideas of normal that was established by this society ended up being harmful, not just to those who existed outside of its parameters. So it's not only harming the people who are considered invalid, it's also harming the people who are considered valid, because they feel like if they are not able to meet that potential that they've been told all their lives that they're supposed to meet, they might as well not exist, because they're not supposed to be failures. Now, why might I bring this up? Because quite frankly, I believe the very idea and notion of normality is a myth. Now, many of us may hear the word myth and recognize one of its definitions that I'm working with, which is something that many people believe but does not exist or is false, according to Oxford Learning Dictionary. And it's true, I am working with that part of the definition. But I also believe that normality, or what is considered normal, exists in the other part of the definition, which reads, a story from ancient times, especially one that was told to explain natural events or to describe the early history of a people. In this way, the idea of what is normal and to be expected is very much a myth as well. The idea of what is normal is very much a story told to explain or describe the early history of people. Only that's never really been the case. Because let's think back to before. If what is considered normal differs from person to person and is based entirely on how that individual experiences their life, think Truman from The Truman Show and how he experienced his entire life on a studio set, and yet everything he thought was normal didn't appear normal to the actors acting right alongside him, let alone to the people who were watching him literally every day. And so differing ideas of conforming to the standard are usual based from the definition of normal. But then you think about the movie Gattaca. Society got to determine what was considered normal, forcing people who they deemed didn't meet their requirements to do one thing, while those who did got to do something else. So like the part of the normal definition about conforming to the expected, meaning that normality was determined by the society you existed in. But how could a society define normality when millions of people and millions of perspectives exist? Short answer, it can't. Slightly longer answer, remember earlier I mentioned a book. The book's full title is The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture by Gabor Maté with David Maté. And in this book, I found this quote. All in all, the system works with cyclic elegance. A culture founded on mistaken beliefs regarding who and what we are creates conditions that frustrate our basic needs, breeding a populace in pain, disconnected from self, others, and meaning. Now, why might I have chosen to bring up this quote in particular? It goes back to what we were discussing earlier. It is not possible for society to define what is normal when the experiences of so many people differ. Even thinking back to the definition of the word myth that I talked about earlier, which said a story from ancient times often told to describe the early history of people. It is difficult to establish normality based on a story that does not take into account all of the perspectives of that time. How does that one quote go? History is told by the victors. So if history is told by a specific group of people, and what is often established as normal is based on that group of people, whose story and whose perspective is not being taken into account. With millions of perspectives across the world and a society built on mistaken beliefs that cannot account for all of those perspectives, the very idea of there being an established normal simply cannot exist. And in this case, is a myth. But hey, maybe existing outside of that normal too can be an art like everything else. Alrighty, so for this week's Awe Moment, I'm actually going to talk about the Kendrick Lamar Super Bowl performance. I thoroughly enjoyed the Kendrick Lamar Super Bowl performance. It was really beautifully done and like a really, really beautiful performance, in my opinion. I know not a lot of people would agree, but again, kind of going back to the whole thing that we were talking about, like the realities and life that was sort of depicted and reflected in that performance isn't the life of everyone who watched that performance. And so it gets to the point where it's like there are some people who are saying that like, hey, that art was weird and it wasn't good. It's not necessary. But there are others who are like that touched on some very real things that I've experienced or that I've witnessed and that like things that I've kind of had to deal with. And so again, kind of going back to like just because you do not recognize a very particular lifestyle or you're not able to relate to a very particular type of art, it doesn't necessarily like denigrate or devalue that art just because you do not, it's not something that would be considered normal for you, not something that you could relate to. Because there's a lot of people on this planet. Not everybody's going to get everything, and that is okay. But yeah, follow me on my social medias. I go by The Lovely Infinite, so TheLVly on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. So feel free to follow me there. Or if you want to just follow just the channel, Art Like Studios everywhere. So TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter as well. Art Like Studios. And be sure to subscribe to be on the lookout for more content from this particular podcast. And if you're following all the Art Like Studios, there may be some more stuff in the future. So yeah, that's all I have for you for today's episode. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.